lovely to be with you again. Some of your faces I recognise from being with you last fall for your anniversary celebration, and I've been looking forward to the opportunity to be with you today. I serve as International Children's Ministry Director for BCM International Bible-Centred Ministries, and in many ways we function as a sister organisation of CEF. We do a lot of the same kinds of ministries and certainly share your heart for seeing children come to know, love and obey God and follow Him for a lifetime. I have a great Pennsylvania Dutch name because I married a man from Berks County. My name doesn't really fit with the rest of me because I come from Scotland. I've been here for the last 10 years, but a good portion of my ministry life with children has been spent in Glasgow, Scotland. But let's just pray as we begin, and then we're going to look at building relationships with our children this morning. Father God, I thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this morning. Lord, I thank you for this group of men and women and for the love that they have for you and the love they have for your word and your gospel and your children. And Father, as we look this morning at ways we build relationship with the children that you've entrusted us with in our ministries, Lord, I pray that we would see them with your eyes, and Lord, that we would love them with the heart that you love them with. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, all of you are working with children, but I'd like to introduce you to a class, and I want you to be thinking in terms of the children you work with and asking yourself, does this class sound familiar? So in this class, there are two well-to-do brothers. They're pretty wealthy, they're used to getting their own way, and they don't like to be crossed. Can I give those to you to hold? In this class, there's a student that's always interrupting the lesson. It's like, Miss, I have a question. You ever had one of those? Let me give that to you to hold. In this class, there's a kid that sits in the corner and always looks like he's up to something. You're never entirely sure what it is, you just know something is going on in the corner. Some of you have a name for him. In this class are two students who take an opposite view on just about anything you can imagine. If one says black, the other says white. If one says up, the other one says down. They just see life completely and utterly differently. Can I ask you to hold those? In this class, there are 3 students who sit in the back row and fade into the woodwork. They're the quiet ones that if you have to almost think really hard to remember what their name is because they barely say anything at all. Can I ask you to hold them?
You didn't know that.
You're just holding him.
You're just holding him.
You're right.
Then there's the student that's just a bit confused all the time. A student that always has that puzzled expression as if to say, I am missing something and I am not quite tracking with the rest of the group. No reflection on who I'm handing them to. Then there's the student that's the eager helper. The student that's always the first to volunteer and say, I'll do that. And he's right there. Thank you. And finally, there's a student that's the literal learner. The one that wants everything explained 2 or 3 times and needs to have control of all of the details before he's going to commit. Can I ask you to hold this one as well? I want you to have a look at this group of students. Do they sound familiar? I'm guessing that if you've worked with children for any length of time, you've probably taught students that look like one or more of these kids. Except that this group of kids wasn't actually a group of kids at all. It was a real class. Do you know whose class it was? This was Jesus' class. He had 12 students. And we are really tempted to look at Jesus' class and say Jesus had an easy group to work with. Jesus had a really tough group to work with. He worked with 12 men who were as different as you could imagine. Let's think about them for a minute. The two well-to-do brothers who are used to getting their own way. Who are they? Thank you. James and John. There is a reason why they were nicknamed the Sons of Thunder. The impatient student who's always interrupting the lesson. Peter. It's got to be Peter. Thank you. The schemer in the corner who seems like he's up to something. Judas. He was stealing from the money bag. The two students whose views on everything are as opposite as can be imagined. A fight waiting to happen. I was going to say, I would suggest Simon and Matthew. Have you ever thought about the fact that Jesus had a tax collector and he had a zealot in the same group of men? Their views on everything were diametrically opposed. And then there's the three students who sit in the back row and you barely remember their names because they don't say anything at all. We've got Thaddeus, Bartholomew, and James the son of Alphaeus. We know they exist because their name's in the list, but that's about the beginning, middle, and end of what we know about them. They were there. The student who always has a puzzled expression as if to say, I don't quite get it. Could have been Thomas, or also could have been Philip. He's asking a lot of questions, uncertain at times. We've got the eager helper. Do a study on Andrew sometime. Whenever there's something to be done, Andrew is right there. He's the one bringing his brother to Jesus. He's the one bringing the boy to Jesus with his lunch. He's the one behind the scenes seeing what he can do to fix the problems. And the literal learner who wants everything explained just so, Thomas. I'm not going to believe unless I can see, unless I can touch for myself. Jesus did not have an ideal group of students to work with. And yet we see Jesus over the course of 3 years interacting with this group of students in a way that changed their lives. And we see him doing a number of different things. We're going to focus in on one of them this morning, but we see Jesus modeling God's truth. And that's where it always starts for us as teachers. We can have all the methods in the world, but unless we ourselves are walking visual aids of what it is that we're teaching, it's not going to make a difference. And yet for Jesus' class, whenever they were unsure about something he was telling them to do, all they needed to do was look at Jesus, and they could see what that looked like in practice. Jesus modeled God's truth. What he said and what he did always matched up. Secondly, Jesus built relationships. And this is where we're going to spend our time this morning. So can we just camp out on this together for a couple of minutes? Let's think about the relationships that Jesus built with this group of 12 men. What were some of the things they did together? They went fishing. What else? They went camping. They probably did. 3 days journey through the desert. There's not really too much else to do. Okay, what else?
Walking, hiking.
They went walking, hiking.
They ate together.
They had meals together. They prayed together. They went on boat rides together. They went to weddings together. They went to funerals together. They cried together. They learned together. Jesus did life with his students for 3 years straight. Now, most of us, if we think about living with our kids for 3 years straight, would probably go demented. And I don't know that that's necessarily what God's called us to, but this principle of being willing to share life with our kids, of being willing to not just be a teacher, but to come alongside and to build relationships of trust that give us the right to share Jesus with our kids. That's something we see in the life of Jesus. But he didn't stop there. Jesus also taught truth effectively. He was an incredible teacher. And we could spend all morning just looking at the way Jesus taught. Just hang on to the fact he was really good. And finally, He always taught for the purpose of response. It was never just to teach that they would know stuff about God. It was always so that they would take what they had heard, that they would be challenged and changed by it, and be putting it into practice. I think when we look at the life of Jesus as a teacher with these 12 men, we see a pattern of what it means to disciple children, what it means to come alongside of our children and help them come to know God, love God, and obey God. And I wanted to give you this big background picture first, because we're going to spend the rest of our time this morning honing in on what it looks like to build relationships with our children. But if we just build relationships without the backdrop of these other pieces, it's not going to be enough. It's a piece of a bigger puzzle that God has called us to as children's leaders. Modeling, relationships, teaching truth, and being willing to challenge for response. But in this session, we want to focus in on building relationships. And can I just say, I look out at this group of people, and some of you have been working with children effectively for much, much longer than I have. And there's nothing that I'm going to share this morning that's going to be brand new. It's certainly not rocket science. But what I hope it is a chance to just refocus and retool as you go into the beginning of a school year. Looking at what are some of the basic things that I'm called to as a children's leader. Because sometimes the longer we're in ministry, the easier it is to forget the basics. And I just want us to kind of focus in, not on necessarily things that are new things, but things that are really, truly important things. So let's have a look at relationships. They start by getting to know our children. And that's so basic. But if we're going to build relationships with our children, we need to get to know them. And while we need to get to know them individually, there's also just some general things that we need to continually remind ourselves about to build relationships with them effectively as children. And I say that because I started off life as a high school teacher. And I still, in many ways, am more comfortable with older children than the younger children. But it was a shock to my system when we had our first baby. And I remember looking at our oldest daughter when she was about 2. And I was pulling my hair out. Nothing had prepared me to be the mother of a 2-year-old. And we were having a rough day. And I remember just looking at her in frustration at one point and saying, "Beck, why are you being so childish?" And then kind of caught myself and realised how ridiculous I sounded standing in my kitchen as I looked at my 2-year-old who had no idea whatsoever of what I'd just asked her. But we do that sometimes. We don't always verbalise it, but we look at our children and say, "Why are you being childish?" What's the obvious answer? They're children. And yet we need to, every so often, and as we work with our volunteers, we really need to be helping continually remind our volunteers we're working with children. And if our expectation is that they're going to be miniature adults, we're continually going to be frustrated. God made them children. And someday they're going to grow up and they're going to be adults. But today they're children. And I'm called to engage with them as children. Not to look at them and wish they were something that God hasn't made them yet. So I'd like you to take a couple of minutes. I'm not going to read through them because that would be incredibly boring. But I'd like you just to scan through the list of characteristics that are on that first page of your worksheet. Now, none of those are going to be incredibly new revelations, but I want you just to think about them for a couple of minutes. What are some of the things that make our children children? All right, with some of those characteristics fresh in your mind, I'd like to tell you a story. I'd like to tell you a story about a girl called Mary who's about 7 years old. And as I tell you about Mary, I'd like for you just to be paying attention in your mind to how is Mary being a typical child. All right, so it's one thing to look at these things as hypothetical characteristics, but let's think about a child. And I want you to recognise Mary as a child. Are you ready? All right. Mary came running into class one evening. She was eager to tell me all about her friend's birthday party that afternoon. All of her friends had been there, and she told me she had eaten at least 20 pieces of cake. Mary said she was looking forward to her birthday since she planned to invite all of her friends and wanted to know if I could come too, since I was her teacher. Then she sat down in the middle row beside her friends and they giggled a little, but soon settled down as we got started. They all joined in the singing with great enthusiasm, but Mary got upset during the quiz because the other team was given 2 chances to answer a question and her team had only been given 1. She sulked for a few minutes, but soon cheered up. She recited last week's memory verse perfectly. Behold, the Lamb of God who taketh away the sin of the world, John chapter 1, verse 29. However, when I asked her what it meant, she had absolutely no idea. All the children listened well during the story until near the end when they started to fidget. The story was about David and Goliath. When I told them that Goliath was looking for someone to fight, Mary asked, why couldn't Samson fight him? He was really good at fighting the Philistines. I explained that Samson probably would have fought Goliath, except that he had lived a long time before and now he was dead. Then I went on with the rest of the story. The children loved the part where David told Goliath he was coming in the name of the Lord and killed him with a single stone. I thought they were all really interested in the lesson until Mary interrupted me and asked me how the pictures stuck to the board. I told her to sit down and not to interrupt, and she burst into tears. I said I was sorry for being cross, and she calmed down. At the end of the lesson, I asked the children how they could stand up for God, like David had. Mary said she was going to tell her best friend at school that she loved Jesus and would invite her to come with her next week. Maybe it wasn't such a bad evening after all. Does Mary sound familiar? She's a pretty typical child. Now, let's just stand back from Mary for a minute and let's think about her. Because sometimes we look at this list of characteristics and we know they're true, but then we look at a child and we still get frustrated that they're true. All right, so let's see if we can take Mary and the characteristics and kind of look at the two of them side by side and say, what do we do with Mary? All right, so let's think about Mary physically. What are some ways that you see Mary being just a typical everyday 7-year-old in this story? She's running. Always running. Lots of energy. Okay, what else? Yeah, she can sit for a while and then after a while she's just done sitting and her body's moving around the place. All right, what else?
Enthusiastic.
Enthusiastic. Okay, in fact, let's look a little bit at social. What are some of the things that you see going on with Mary socially?
Big party.
Yeah, parties, friends, love friends. What else?
Sitting with her friends.
Okay, she's going to sit with her friends until somebody tells her she can't. That's where she's going to park herself. What else?
Strong sense of justice.
Bothered her. Sorry, the
Okay.
sense of justice. And
Sense of justice was a big deal. I'm guessing that, like me, you've heard a bunch of kids a bunch of times say, but that's not fair. And sometimes they're right. Okay, fairness matters. What else? Somebody said something over here. Eager to please people she cares about. Where do you see that? Yeah, you're my teacher. I want you to come to my party. You're a really important person in my life. And I think sometimes as leaders we fail to recognize the fact that we are actually kind of important people in the lives of our children. What we think matters to them often. Okay, what about emotionally? Okay, she dissolved at one point when she thought I was being cross with her. What else?
She got over it very fast.
Yeah.
Didn't ruin her whole day.
Yeah, children, at least many children that I interact with, seem to go like this, and they seem to go like this pretty quickly. There's high ups and there's low downs, and they sometimes happen impossibly close to each other. All right, what else? Maybe it goes with that, but she's fragile. And I think that's something that we need to be so constantly aware of as we interact with our children. I don't want you to answer out loud, But I'd like you to think, as you think back to your own experience as a child, can you think of a time where somebody in your life, whether a parent or a teacher or a leader, said something to you that really hurt? Now, for all of us, that was a really long time ago. And yet, something that might have just been a throwaway comment, that the person who said it forgot about it in a couple of minutes, lodged in your mind as a child. And maybe 40 years later, 50 years later, it still cuts. We need to be careful. God's entrusted us with ministry to children, and part of recognizing that we're ministering with children is recognizing that they're pretty fragile. Even the ones that put on the tough exterior bravado. You know, they haven't built those layers of protection yet. And the things that sometimes we just throw away as comments can cut really deep. Remember, our children are children. What about mentally? How do you see some of these characteristics?
She all of a sudden wondered about how the figure stuck. So she's curious, but kind of out of context.
Children are constantly curious. And they will be curious about whatever pops into their mind, whether it's relevant to what you're hoping is in their mind at that moment in time or not, right? Now, as a teacher, I can either get really irritated with her for being curious, or I can help her recognize that there's a more appropriate time to think about that. Come and talk to me later. All right, what else do you see about her? She's curious. What else?
She exaggerated eating 20 pieces of cake.
Okay, at least we're really kind of hoping she's exaggerated. And children's view of time and numbers, it's very fluid. You know, numbers don't necessarily mean anything particularly accurate to a child. That's her way of saying, I ate a lot. And she probably did. All right, what else?
The concept of time is when she mentioned Samson. She evidently thought of him like a hero, but
Yeah.
she had no idea where he fit in the picture timeline.
Yeah, and that's actually something we're going to talk about more this afternoon as we think about helping children understand and discover the Bible. Because children have very little innate sense of time and chronology. For most children, there are two eras. There is the era before I was born, and there is the era since I was born. Everything that happened before I was born just kind of gets mushed together into this big blob. We need to be careful, because we might be teaching about Jesus one week, and about David the next week, and maybe a month later we're teaching about Moses. Now we know that these things happen in sequence, but our kids might be utterly clueless. It's like, well, Samson fought the Philistines. It's perfectly logical that he would have decided to fight Goliath. And it is. Except we know he was dead. So, all right, what else? Memorize verse. Children memorize wonderfully. God's given them an incredible capacity to memorize. But what was the issue with her memory? Yeah, and that's something that we need to keep, even as seasoned children's leaders, we need to keep reminding ourselves. Our children can repeat back, sound for sound, what we just said. But in many ways, a lot of children repeat in the way that a parrot does. They can repeat the sounds in sequence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have understood and comprehended on any level what it is that they're saying. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't teach memory. We absolutely teach memory. It's a fantastic time to help our children hide God's word in their heart. But we want to teach for understanding as well. And we want to be continually remembering that just because the children can answer the questions correctly doesn't necessarily mean that they've understood and processed what they're saying. All right? They're children. Anything else we want to add to that? If not, let's look at spiritual. Spiritual characteristics of children. How do we see Mary responding as a child?
She wanted to stand for God.
Sorry?
Stand for God and abide her friend.
Okay, in spite of everything that's happened in the course of the last 45 minutes, she has still heard God's word and is open to putting that into practice in her life. And I think sometimes as leaders we can get incredibly discouraged because all these things happen in the course of an hour, and we're like, did anybody actually get anything out of anything that I did today? And I'm sure all of us have had meetings like that. We're like, did I talk to the wall? And yet children seem to have this capacity to deal with all these things and still be able to hear. And if God's speaking to their heart, still be able to respond. And in many ways, you know this as well as I do, children respond much more readily and much more easily in faith than adults do. Mary doesn't question about whether this kid is able to defeat a giant with God's help. The Bible says it. My teachers told me that. There's a capacity for great faith. Now we could spend all morning on that, and we're not going to, but I just wanted to do some review of that together. As you go into the school year, relationships start by remembering that your children are children. And if we don't remember that they're children, we're going to find ourselves like I was in the kitchen, looking at them saying, why are you being childish? And if I'm constantly frustrated at my children for not being adults, I'm going to really struggle to connect with them where they are and to build relationships that lead to discipleship. But as well as I know my children as children, I also want to take time to get to know them as individuals. And again, there's nothing I'm going to share that's rocket science, but I hope that it helps us refocus as we go into a new school year. How do I get to know my children? I want to listen to them. Again, that's so obvious, but I'm convinced that there are a lot of children that come in and out of our ministries that nobody listens to on a consistent basis. And listening takes a couple different forms. One of the ways we listen is just by being organized enough ahead of time to eavesdrop on conversations they're having. Call it sanctified eavesdropping. But I find I learn so much about my kids just by listening to the conversations they have. What do they think is important? Who's spending time with who? What do they like? What don't they like? What's going on in their lives? What bothers them? Because I'm going to get one set of information by asking them questions. I'm going to get a different set of information by just listening as they ask each other questions. Right, so listening well. But not just listening as eavesdropping, but when a child comes and talks to you, giving the gift of truly listening. And I'm guessing that you struggle with this as much as I do. That I'm busy. And there's a lot of times that I'll roll into a children's meeting and I'm focused on getting organized. I need to get set up. I need to tell everybody what they need to be doing. I need to make sure that my teaching materials are organized. I've got all this stuff going on that's priority for me. And meanwhile, there's maybe 6 children around me and they're all talking at the same time. And I have a tendency to just start going, and I'm really thinking about what I'm doing. Now, there's times that happens and that needs to happen, but if that's the only way that we engage in conversations with our children, we're not going to build relationships. Remember when Dave and I were leading clubs in inner city Glasgow, we struggled with this. We were one club in particular, we were leading in an inner city area, and the kids truly had very, very few people in their lives that invested time and energy in them. So they loved to come on Tuesday nights. So our strategy was to try and get there before the children. And we never really did figure it out, because no matter how early we got there, they were there before us. And no matter how hard we tried to get there before they did to set up, it never quite worked. And there were other things we needed to do to kind of try and find that time and space to set up and invest time in listening. So whatever it is that you need to do to reorganize your schedule to do that, try to do that. Try to be in a place that when a child wants to talk to you, you're able, if not in that moment, but just to say, like, you know what, let's sit down And I'd like you to tell me about that. And I think even in our kids that come from good, what we would call good families, or church families, there's a lot of kids that don't get listened to very much. So the gift of listening is often where relationships start. But it's not just listening, it's also observing. It's being freed up enough from all the responsibilities I need to take care of to actually notice what's going on with the children in my class. Because again, sometimes there's things that are happening right under our nose and we see them, but we don't see them. For example, let's say you're starting to kind of pay attention to what's happening with your kids, and you realize that for a couple weeks straight, this one child is sat by themselves. All right, you hadn't noticed that before, but now you've noticed it. What could it mean? What could be going on? There's no right answer, so you can say just about anything.
Someone in class could be picking on them, so they want to stay away.
Okay, so maybe there's a kid that's picking on them and it's just easier to fade into the corner. What else could be going on?
Family problems.
Okay, maybe there's something big going on at home and they're coming in and their minds are just not on what you're doing. Their minds are still in the fight that just happened before they walked out the door. What else?
Poor self-esteem.
Okay, maybe the child feels like nobody likes me. Or maybe the child truly doesn't have anybody that's nice to them in the group.
It could be poor hygiene and the other kids don't want to get close.
Okay, maybe the child smells. Everybody sits on the other side of the room. Okay, there could be a whole long list of reasons why that's happening. Observing isn't going to tell you why it's happening, but when you've taken enough time that all of a sudden that you've flagged the fact, hey, this is happening, that's when it gives you something to follow up on. Because obviously something's happening, but if you've been too busy to even notice, it's tough to move beyond that. Let's say that a child misbehaves whenever you ask them to read.
Maybe they're embarrassed.
Okay, maybe they're embarrassed and they don't like to be put on the spot. What else?
Maybe they can't read.
Maybe they can't read. I include that because that happened to me once as a teacher. It was actually with a middle school group, and I just had the hardest time disciplining this group. I could not figure out what to do, and for 6 months I struggled. I pulled out every discipline technique I could think of, and none of them were working. Until about 6 months in, the pastor said, by the way, do you know that Stephen can't read? And I kicked myself because after 6 months, if I had been observing, I would have realized that every time Stephen misbehaved, it was when I pulled out a piece of paper. It was his way of making sure I never asked him to read, because he didn't want to have to tell everybody in the class he couldn't read. So as a teacher, I would have saved myself a lot of time and energy and tears and frustration if I had noticed that that was happening a couple weeks into the school year instead of taking 6 months. Because as soon as I realized that was happening, I adjusted and the discipline problem went away. Right, so observing. Taking time to just notice what's going on. Child has a large bruise. That could mean a million things. It could mean he's really clumsy. It could mean somebody's hurting him at school. It could mean somebody's hurting him at home. All right? You don't know, but if you don't notice, you can't follow up. All right, so take time to listen. Take time to observe, to notice the things that are going on with the kids in your group. But more than that, it's showing an interest. And if you oversee a whole bunch of clubs, it's hard. It's hard to engage individually with children. And sometimes I've decided that I'm horrible with names, so that the best thing for me to do is to buy a set of cheap address labels and just have the children wear name tags. But what I don't want to do is to be constantly saying, hey, you in the blue shirt in the corner. And I've seen teachers do that. And every time they do, it's like, oh, no kid wants to be the one in the blue shirt in the corner. All right, so learning their names or finding ways to cope if you're rubbish at remembering their names. But Being able to use their names, it's such a basic thing, but it matters. Becoming a good questioner. Maybe it's the child that doesn't talk much, but learning to ask good questions. Not just the quick yes or no questions or the one-word answer questions, but the get to know you questions, the ones that maybe you have a question of the week, where it's, if you could change one thing about the world, what would you change? Or if you won $1 million, what would you do with it? Or if you could be anything at all when you grew up, what would you be? Right, questions that allow us to show that we truly care what children think, that allow us to get to know them. And when we start asking those kind of questions, we learn things about kids we never knew. And sometimes they're really fun. Showing an interest. Spending time. Ultimately, a lot of the things come down to spending time, don't they? When I'm rushing in at the last possible minute, and I'm completely engaged with what I'm doing, and I'm rushing out as soon as possible afterwards, I'm going to struggle to build relationships. Because relationships take time. It's so much easier to just run programs. And yet programs don't disciple children. People disciple children. People who model. People who build relationships. And then earn the right to teach and to challenge for response. It takes time. Maybe it's committing to arrive early and leave later. Maybe it's organising an outside of club time with the kids. Making sure you've got enough leaders and appropriate parental permission and all the stuff that goes with that. But communicating to the children, I don't just care about you when you're in club. I care about you. Maybe it's sending notes to the children. One of the best teachers I ever knew was one of the most unlikely teachers you can imagine. I had her as a teacher when I was about 8 years old. She was, at that point, over 80, and she had a class that she dealt with by herself of probably about 15 or so 8-year-olds. And there's a lot of church children's ministry directors I know that would have just said, absolutely not, that's not going to work. And yet, she was an incredible teacher. And it wasn't because she was the most exciting person on the church volunteer list. It wasn't because she did the biggest noisy activities. She certainly didn't. She did one thing, well, she did a few things, but one thing stuck out in the mind of every kid she ever taught. Every week, she sent a letter to every child in her class. She might have been in her 80s, but that was what she had decided she was going to do to show her children that she cared about them. I still have a letter she sent to me. And I'll not read the whole thing, but to give you an idea, Dear Esther, we had company in class last week from Long Island and so on. Our lesson told us about the power Jesus had over nature, wind and waves. We talked about swine and how 2,000 of them ran into the lake and were drowned. Swine are pigs, and that's why I'm sending little pigs this week. On Sunday, we're going to talk about Jesus at a pool. Not to swim, but to heal a man on the Sabbath. We're looking forward to having you with us. I hope you'll sing with us. Thank you for being a great girl for Jesus. Every week. I'm sure it took a good bit of energy. But she had 15 8-year-olds that would have done anything in the world for her. Now that was a while ago. I'm 42 and I was 8 then, so it's a while ago. But when we were working in Scotland, we had an older Scottish missionary come to us. Her name was Katie. And she had just returned from Kenya where she had served for 40 years. Amazing lady. But she was absolutely terrified of Scottish children. She says, I can't do it. I know how to work with Kenyan children. I have no idea what to do with Scottish kids. They scare me. And we talked about this whole building relationships thing, and I shared with her about this teacher, and Katie's eyes lit up. She said, I can do that. You know, Katie started doing what this teacher did. Every week, she sent a letter to the children in her Sunday school class. Those kids would have done anything for Katie. She came to me laughing a few months later, and she said the teenagers just came to me as a delegation. They said, nobody writes to us, Katie. You need to write to us. We want letters too. And all of a sudden, she knew every kid in the church knew her, and she had a voice into their lives. It didn't matter that culturally they were worlds apart. It didn't matter that she was in her 70s and they were teenagers in a city in Scotland. She had invested time and energy to communicate, I care about you. And as a result, they were willing to listen. It's not rocket science. It's just really, really important stuff that we don't always take time to do. Listen, observe, show an interest, spend time. So I want to get to know my children. I want to get to know them as children. I want to get to know them individually as individual, unique people. But I also want to communicate that I value them. And sometimes we don't really think about that because we're like, well, they're important to God. I'm investing my life in being a children's worker. Surely they know that they're important to me. I show up every week. Isn't that enough? And yet, I think as children, they don't always measure value by the same things we measure value as. We tend to measure value by the big things. Hey, I do this full time. I'm living sacrificially. I'm here every week. I spend hours preparing to teach. Like, those are the things we tend to measure. The things that the children tend to measure are the little things that slip through the cracks in our minds often. I want you to think for a minute and put yourself in the shoes of Mary or any other 7-year-old kid you know. And we're going to just do a thumbs up or thumbs down. I want to give you a series of scenarios, everyday things that could happen in a classroom. And I want you to think about them through Mary's eyes. Are these things that would make you feel valued? Or would they make you feel unvalued? As I said, they're not the big things. They're the little things that sometimes we don't even notice. All right, so thumbs up, thumbs down. Do the children know that I value them by the way I welcome them? The teacher's busy getting the room ready and doesn't notice when I come in with my brother. On the other hand, the teacher greets me by name and asks me how my soccer game went last week. Yeah. Do the children know that I value them by the way that I listen to them? I tell my teacher that my cat died yesterday, but she just nods and says, that's nice. I worry sometimes how many times I might have done that to a child, where they're talking and I'm just nodding and going, and not actually processing what's being said. Hopefully, I've never done that with a dead pet. I tell my teacher I won a contest last week. He stops what he's doing and he says, tell me about it. Huge difference. Do the children know I value them by the way I invest my time in them? The teacher sends me a note telling the class miss me when I was absent because I was sick. Yeah. Do the teacher know that I value them do the children know I value them by the way I respond to their ideas and help? I tried to pick up a visual that had fallen to the floor, but the teacher told me to stop being disruptive and get back in my seat. Sometimes we're kind of tunnel vision focused and we miss what actually happened. Teacher asked me if I could help the younger ones find the verses since I'm so good at it. I can help. I've got something to offer. Do the children know I value them by the way I provide for their physical needs? The teacher brings a snack to keep us going. I remember every single teacher in my life that ever brought snacks. When I took over as director for our Sunday school ministry, I took a poll of the children. I said, if you could change anything about Sunday school, what would you change? You know what they told me? We want a snack time. That was easy. They got one of the older men in the church. He baked cookies for them every week. They were thrilled. He was thrilled. Everybody was happy. I need to stretch my legs, but the teacher tells me to stop fidgeting. Yeah. Wasn't purposely fidgeting. My legs needed stretch. Some of you might feel like that right now. Do the children know I value them by the way I pray for them? Johnny poked me and called me names during the whole meeting. Wrong one. Teacher asked if I have anything I'd like him to pray about, and he writes it down in his notebook. Yeah. This is something that's going to happen. He's actually going to pray for me. He's not just asking. Do the children know I value them by the way I respond to discipline problems? Here we go. Johnny poked me, called me names during the whole meeting, but the teacher ignored it. Yeah. Discipline isn't just about our convenience. It's about whether our kids feel safe and feel valued. Children are vulnerable. The little things that we do have the potential to either crush them and tear them down, or to build them up and encourage them. And we need sometimes to take off our big people glasses and look at life through the kids that we're working with, through their eyes. What are the things that they're noticing? The things that they're seeing as important? Because it's often the little things that we do that add up that make the difference, not the huge big things that we think are making the difference. We could talk hypothetically about building relationships for hours. But what I'd love to do as we finish is just for you to turn around to the other people at your table, because although you're not working with the same group of children, you're working in similar kinds of contexts, I'm assuming. So I'd like to just turn around to a couple of people next to you and brainstorm what are like 2 or 3 things I could do this fall to actively be building relationships with my children, getting to know them and showing them that they're valued. Okay? So just a couple of minutes, turn to the people next to you and like to brainstorm 3 or 4 things you could do. Jesus had a really tough class. It wasn't that he had the perfect class that was easy to work with and that's why they turned out so well. He had a really hard class, but he invested 3 years in modeling God's truth, in building relationships, in teaching truth and challenging them for response. And at the end of 3 years, 11 out of 12 of those students turned the world upside down. It makes a difference. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the work that you do with children. And we'll chat more after lunch. Thank you.